If a convenience store can become a cultural operating system, then what else have we misunderstood about power? Because the wild part isn't that 7-Eleven got bigger in Japan, it's that a boring licensing deal quietly outsmarted the original brand. And once you see how that happened, you start realizing the real story was never about snacks. It was about adaptation, density, and control. So let's get into how that happened, because the setup is crazier than you think. Bro, Japanese 7-Eleven is like the final boss of convenience stores. You walk in for a water and leave with a life upgrade. And the crazy part is it started as just a licensing deal. Like a boring corporate agreement accidentally built an empire? That is the most unsexy origin story for a giant brand ever. Wait, so the American original basically got outplayed by the copy? That is humiliating in a very quiet corporate way. But it makes sense once you hear the Japan part. Tokyo was dense, late night, and people actually needed real food nearby. Not just chips and soda, but actual dinner after work. Imagine if your corner store solved your entire tired adult problem. That sounds small until you realize it changes everything. The big move was not copying America blindly. They adapted to urban life instead of forcing suburban logic onto it, which is usually where companies get lazy and self-destruct. They also used local franchise owners, which is huge, because the person running the store actually understood the neighborhood. Shocking concept, right? Let locals run local businesses. Some boardroom probably needed 20 years to discover that. And then they clustered stores instead of spreading them randomly. That sounds counterintuitive at first, like cannibalizing yourself. But it creates density, routes, logistics, and repeat habits. It is basically convenience as infrastructure, not just retail. America loves empty parking lots, so of course that model struggled there. Yeah, try making a cluster strategy work around 6 lanes and a gas station. The food angle is what really gets people, though. Egg salad sandwiches, bento boxes, Japanese breads, all that stuff. People act shocked that convenience store food can taste good. But honestly, the expectation in America is so low it is tragic. The bar is basically on the floor and still somehow falling. Japan treated fresh food like the main product, not an afterthought. That changes the whole identity of the store. Suddenly, it is not a pit stop. It is a reliable meal source. That is a massive shift for a brand name people already knew. And then American 7-Eleven kind of got left with the old version. Which is brutal, because the original becomes the laggard. That is why the irony is so good, though. The student became the parent, and the parent needed coaching. That should be impossible, but business loves impossible things. And now the US side is openly saying it needs a turnaround. When a company starts copying its own overseas child, that is wild. That is not a growth story, that is a family intervention. A very expensive family intervention. But do you think the Japanese model can even be copied elsewhere? I mean, some of it is clearly design and operations. But some of it feels like culture, density, and consumer expectations. Like, can you just export that magic into a different country? Retail people love saying yes right before reality punches them. The weird part is the model is simple when you say it fast. Better locations, better food, better service, tighter logistics. But executing that every day is the whole game. The boring stuff is always the superpower, which is annoying. Everyone wants a genius founder story, and it is just execution. Japan also understood that convenience is emotional, not just practical. People trust the store because it always shows up the same way. That consistency is kind of comforting when life is chaotic. Okay, that part is actually deeper than it sounds. Because when you are tired, you do not want discovery. You want certainty. Exactly, and Japanese 7-Eleven built around that exact feeling. So every store becomes a tiny machine for lowering friction. Meanwhile, a lot of American retail is still adding friction for sport. Nothing says convenience like 3 broken self-checkout machines. And 1 employee guarding the whole chaos zone. The crazy thing is, that Japanese model probably scales because it is disciplined. But discipline is also what makes it hard to copy. You cannot just slap on better sandwiches and call it transformation. Companies do that all the time and then act surprised. They repaint the sign and think the universe will clap. The real lesson is probably that local adaptation beats brand arrogance, especially when the local version gets close to the customer every day. That is the uncomfortable part for big companies. The customer is not impressed by your origin story. Yeah, nobody at midnight cares about Texas in 1927. They care whether the sandwich is good and the store is open, and whether it feels like the place understands them. That is probably why Japan made it feel so natural. It was built around real life, not a theoretical customer. What a radical business strategy. Absolutely insane. They should study that in schools. I also think the store clustering is underrated genius. More stores nearby means more coverage and better supply rhythm. It turns one store into part of a system, not a lonely outpost. And systems usually win against isolated hero stores. Hero store is such a funny phrase for a gas station chain. But you know what I mean? The one random store in the middle of nowhere. Japan basically said, no, we want density, trust, and repetition. That repetition is what builds habits so fast. And habits are where the money actually gets made. Not in the hype, in the repeat visit. Which is why the American business looks weak next to it. If your competitor owns the habit, you are already in trouble. Especially when your own brand is the one teaching you the lesson. That is savage, honestly. I think this whole story is really about humility. The willingness to say, this version works better, let us learn. Most companies would rather protect pride than improve. Pride is expensive, apparently. The shareholder report should have a pride tax line item. And maybe that is why Japan ended up ahead. They kept listening to the customer while everyone else admired the logo. That feels like the whole answer, honestly. Like, great brands are not statues, they are living systems. And the ones that survive are the ones that keep changing. Which is funny because convenience stores are supposed to be boring. Turns out boring is just disguised precision. Yeah, and Japanese 7-Eleven made precision look effortless. That is probably the part everyone misses when they just talk about the food. The food is the visible part, but the machine underneath is the story. And that machine is hard to copy unless you rebuild the whole culture. Which is basically why the answer is no, not easily. Corporate consultants hate that answer. Because it cannot be turned into a 10-slide deck. But that is the truth, right? You can copy features, but not the whole ecosystem. And that ecosystem is why Japan won the 7-Eleven story. Pretty wild for a company people mostly think of as Slurpees. Dude, that is exactly how legends get underestimated. The funniest part is the smallest store can expose the biggest weaknesses. If your corner store is mediocre, the whole promise feels fake. And if it is excellent, everything else looks a little lazy. That is the uncomfortable benchmark problem. Anyway, I could talk about convenience stores way longer than I should. Which says something deeply wrong about both of us. No, it says we respect operational genius. Fair. It starts in Tokyo, and suddenly the whole business model changes. Because in Tokyo, a bad store is not a small mistake. It is visible instantly. In America, you can hide bad stores behind parking lots and nostalgia. That is brutal, but also kind of true. Dense cities punish laziness in a way suburbs never do. Exactly, and Japan had to serve people walking, commuting, and rushing home. So the store could not just be a place for chips and regret. Chips and regret is actually a very American category. Japanese 7-Eleven had to be useful, fast, and weirdly good. And that is where the food thing becomes the whole game. Fresh food turned the store from a stop into a habit. Not just snacks either, actual meals people trusted. The egg sandwich becoming a cultural object is hilarious. Imagine if American 7-Eleven had one item people revered. It would be the taquito, and even that feels generous. But the bigger move was not food alone, it was location strategy. They clustered stores so each one reinforced the others. Which sounds dangerous until you realize foot traffic is the moat. Exactly, more stores meant more data, more demand, more efficiency. And the franchise model mattered because local owners actually knew the neighborhood. That local knowledge is the whole cheat code. Corporate people love pretending they can centralize intuition. Then they open a store and wonder why nobody buys warm sadness. Warm sadness is a very specific inventory problem. But seriously, the franchisees were not just rent collectors. They were operating eyes on the ground, adjusting fast. That makes the whole system feel less like a chain and more like an organism. Yes, and that is why copying it is so hard. People think success is the sandwich, but it is really the machine. The sandwich is just the visible tip of an ops iceberg. Ops iceberg is an insane phrase, but I accept it. What really gets me is how the American parent became the struggling one. That reversal is almost too perfect to be real. The licensee outgrew the original and then bought the parent Inspirit. Inspirit is doing a lot of work there. The child became the competent adult, and the parent got the messy apartment. That is such a vicious analogy. But it is weirdly what happened. The U.S. chain had scale but not enough distinctiveness. Scale without identity is just a lot of locations repeating one problem. Japan turned identity into operations, which is the genius part. They did not ask what a convenience store was supposed to be. They asked what people in this exact place needed right now. That sounds simple until you try to do it every single day, which is where most businesses start lying to themselves. They also seem obsessed with making tiny improvements. Tiny improvements compound when a store touches millions of people. And because the stores are so close together, you can test and adapt fast. That is a massive advantage if your whole culture tolerates iteration. Corporate America usually calls that instability and writes a memo about it, then holds a meeting to discuss the memo. The other thing is service, not just product. They made the store useful for payments, bills, picking up basics, all of it. That turns a store into infrastructure. Yeah, it stops being retail and starts being part of daily life. And once that happens, people do not compare you with other stores anymore. They compare you with convenience itself. That is a terrifying standard to own. But if you can own it, you print loyalty. So when U.S. leaders say they want to become more like Japan, I get the instinct. I just do not know if you can import culture like a vending machine part. Culture like a vending machine part is wild. You can copy formats, but not the invisible habits underneath. Like what, specifically? Trust in local operators, obsession with freshness, and patience for long-term compounding. So basically the three things quarterly capitalism hates. Exactly, because none of that looks sexy in a slide deck. But the stores are proof that boring discipline can become glamorous at scale. That is maybe the real twist of the whole story. The best convenience store in the world is not flashy, it is relentlessly practical. And once practical becomes delightful, people notice. Especially when the sandwich is weirdly excellent. I keep coming back to that irony, though. The Japanese company controlling the American original is such a corporate plot twist. Disney could never write something that on the nose. Because it sounds fictional, but it is just execution. And execution is the part everybody underestimates until they lose. Maybe that is why the Japanese model feels uncopyable. It is not one innovation, it is 1,000 connected decisions. Which means you cannot just buy the logo and expect magic. You can buy the sign, not the system. That is the line, honestly. And maybe that is the lesson beyond convenience stores, too. The best companies are often just very good at ordinary things. Repeated long enough, ordinary turns into unfair advantage. That is the most boring superpower ever, which is why it keeps beating the loud ones. And now every American retailer is staring at Japan like, wait, what did we miss? A lot, apparently. That is a devastatingly short answer. But maybe the honest one. Because Japan did not just copy 7-Eleven, they basically reprogrammed it. Like the brand walked in wearing one outfit and came out with a new nervous system. And that starts with one weirdly lucky licensing deal, which sounds boring until you see the outcome. In the 1970s, Tokyo needed stores built for dense city life, not suburban sprawl. That changes everything, because location math is the whole game. In America, a convenience store can be a pit stop. In Japan, it became infrastructure. That is such a gigantic difference hiding inside the same logo. They also used local franchise owners, which sounds small, but it is huge. Because then the stores learn the neighborhood instead of guessing from a headquarters spreadsheet. Centralized chains love efficiency until reality shows up with traffic patterns and rice balls. Bro, imagine running a national chain like every city is Dallas with different traffic lights. Japan basically said, no, the store has to bend to the street. And once you do that, the product mix stops being generic junk. Suddenly, it is fresh food, practical meals, and things people actually need on the way home. That egg salad sandwich keeps getting mentioned like it is a national treasure, which is hilarious, because in America, egg salad at a gas station sounds like a warning. In Japan, it sounds like lunch with standards. But that quality is not magic, it is operations. The whole thing depends on getting inventory, freshness, and demand right every single day. Which is where most chains get lazy and start selling sadness in plastic. Sadness in plastic is brutal but accurate. They did the opposite by treating convenience like a premium service. And then they clustered stores close together instead of spreading them thin. That part is wild, because instinct says more distance should mean less cannibalization. But clustered stores can share demand, logistics, and local density. It is a very unsexy answer to a sexy business problem. The answer is basically, be close to people where people already are. Which is so obvious now that it feels insulting. The market loves a genius after the fact. Right, and once the stores are close together, delivery gets smarter too. Smaller routes, faster restocking, tighter feedback loops. That is how convenience turns into a machine. I think the American version got trapped in the idea of just being nearby. Nearby is not enough if the store feels half asleep and the food tastes like regret. You keep coming back to regret, and honestly, it is the right word. The Japanese model was more like, we will solve your entire errand in one stop. Drinks, lunch, payments, printing, little services, all of it. Wait, the store became a utility hub. Exactly. And that makes people come back for reasons beyond snacks. Once a store becomes useful, it stops competing only on price. It competes on trust and habit. That is the real moat, and it is embarrassingly simple. Which makes me wonder why America keeps trying to scale the wrong part. Because corporations love visible things, like square footage and store count. Invisible things like reliability are less sexy for investor slides. Investor slides are basically performance art for adults. But Japan also had the perfect urban environment for this. Dense neighborhoods, long work hours, lots of foot traffic, and smaller living spaces. So the model is not just genius, it is context-dependent genius. Yes, and that is why everyone asking, can we just copy it, is missing the point. You can copy the surface, but not the ecosystem. You need the right cities, the right logistics, the right habits, and the right expectations. Otherwise, you just build a fancier disappointment. A premium disappointment is honestly the most modern business category. And that is why the irony matters so much now. The Japanese parent company now controls the American chain. That sentence still feels backwards if you grew up on the original brand. America invented it, and then outsourced the winning version. That is such a cold summary of global capitalism. But it also says something uncomfortable about adaptation. The place that had to make it work became better at the thing than the place that made it first. That happens when one side is attached to legacy and the other side is obsessed with usefulness. Legacy can be a disease if it makes you protect the wrong parts. Meanwhile, Japanese 7-Eleven kept iterating like a living system. That is the part people miss when they romanticize the sandwiches. The food matters, but the operating discipline is the actual story. Nobody goes viral for a supply chain, and yet here we are. The supply chain won the culture war quietly. And now American 7-Eleven is under pressure to become more like its Japanese cousin, which is such a humiliating sentence for the original company. Your child came home with better grades and now tutors you. That is awful, but yes, that is exactly the vibe. The real question is whether that model can travel again. Can you take the Japanese system and drop it into a different country without breaking it? My guess is not cleanly because habits are local too. People think products travel, but behavior travels slower. You can import the store, not the culture around the store. And that is why this story is bigger than convenience stores. It is really about who learns from whom and who refuses to. Also, who is willing to sell a sandwich people actually respect. Respectable sandwiches are a more serious economic force than people admit. Honestly, if a store can fix lunch and errands, that is not a store anymore. It becomes part of daily life, and that is way harder to replace. Which is probably why the Japanese version feels almost inevitable in hindsight, even though it clearly was not inevitable at all. That is the beauty of business history. It looks neat only after the chaos wins. And the chaos here was a bunch of smart local choices compounding for decades. So maybe the lesson is not copy Japan, but learn how hard adaptation really is. Exactly, because the real advantage was never the logo. It was the stubborn refusal to be a mediocre store, which, for a convenience store, is kind of an outrageous ambition. And somehow that outrageous ambition is what made it normal for millions of people. That is the weirdest part, right? The best systems disappear into everyday life. And then everyone else spends years trying to figure out why they still feel clunky. That's the trap, because people see good food and miss the system underneath it. It is not just better sandwiches, it is operational wizardry in a snack jacket. Japan had dense cities, late workers, and tiny trips, so the store had to earn its rent every hour. In America, we built big parking lots and then acted surprised people wanted speed. That clustering thing is so underrated because one store alone is just a store. 3 stores around one neighborhood becomes a supply chain with legs. And that changes everything, because now you can move fresh food constantly. Fresh food in a convenience store used to sound like a prank. Right, like who goes to 7-Eleven for a meal and leaves emotionally satisfied? But that is exactly why it worked, because it solved the daily lunch problem. It was built around real habits, not some abstract retail strategy deck. The franchise owners matter too, because local people spot local demand faster. A remote corporate brain never notices the neighborhood guy buying coffee at 6:10. The local owner does, and then suddenly the store is weirdly psychic. That is the difference between standardization and responsiveness. And honestly, the American version feels stuck in its own old assumptions. Too much snack aisle, not enough reason to stay. Exactly, it was built for passing through, not for serving a life. Japan flipped that and made the store part of the life rhythm. That is why the egg salad sandwich became iconic, because it was great and ordinary at once. The funny part is people treat that like a cultural mystery instead of business design. But culture and design are glued together here. You cannot separate them cleanly. Still, can you really copy that somewhere else just by trying harder? I mean, unless you can copy Tokyo density, no. Exactly, you cannot just will a city into being the right shape. You can borrow the habits, but the environment has to cooperate. And now it gets hilarious because the Japanese company controls the American one. That is such a corporate plot twist. The student became the parent and then started grading the homework. And the grade is basically try harder, guys. There is a real humility in that story if you think about it. The brand did not stay great by worshiping its original version. It stayed great by letting the better market teach it. Which is rare because most companies would rather protect pride than improve. Pride is expensive, especially when the competitor is your own franchise model. That sentence sounds illegal somehow. And the turnaround pressure on the US side shows how much the gap matters now. Not just financially, but culturally too, because people expect more from convenience now. Exactly. Convenience is no longer enough if the experience feels dumb. In 2026, a bad store is just offensive. Bro, if I have to wait and the coffee tastes like punishment, I'm leaving angry. That emotional standard is the real lesson, not just the profit math. People remember when a tiny place made their day easier. They also remember when it wastes their time. And most stores underestimate how personal inconvenience feels. So the Japanese model is not magic, it is just extreme attention. Which is harder than magic, honestly. Way harder because magic does not need inventory management. And that is probably why everyone admires it from a distance. Once you try to build it, you realize it is 1,000 tiny decisions. That is the whole story, right? The store looks simple, but the thinking is absolutely not. And maybe that is the best kind of business lesson.